Recording in progress.
Hello, and welcome to this session on Business Ambition for 1.5, a call to action. My name is Antonia Gavel, and I head the World Economic Forum's climate action work. I'm joining you here today from Glasgow, where, as I'm sure many of you are aware, world leaders are gathering to discuss really how to get the world back on track to be able to maintain a safe climate. And today, what we're particularly excited to do is to be gathering here with a number of our CEOs to really talk about how business in particular can play an important role in accelerating ambition for tackling climate change. Our Alliance of CEO Climate Leaders, as I'm sure many of you saw, issued an open letter last week with over 91 CEOs really making a call and a stand for their really ability to drive climate ambition, but also really setting a tone that in order to do more, we really need collaboration with other stakeholders, in particular with governments. This group of 91 CEOs, of course, represents an incredible amount of global representation from over 25 countries across 12 industries. And all of these members have set high ambitions to tackle their own climate emissions within their businesses, not only in 2050, but also in 2030. And of course, in this open letter, what we are highlighting is that ambition, but yes, that need to collaborate with governments, but also to bring more businesses into this ambitious agenda is really critical for us to, one, hit the Paris Climate Agreement, but also really to transition the economy in a way that is also equitable and just. And so really with this session, we're looking forward to discussing with them and with all of you in the audience as well, how we can collectively ramp up progress on this agenda. So before we jump into the conversation with our CEOs, what we would love to do is actually hear a little bit from the audience who is with us here today. So if I can ask my colleagues to just put up our Slido poll, where we will ask you as the audience to tell us what you think business can do to accelerate this transition. So what you can do is scan this QR code that you see here, go to Slido, and in just a few words, help us really set the tone for this conversation. What is your expectations of the business leaders here on the phone and around the world in terms of their role really in helping accelerate the climate agenda? Let us just give it a short minute to see what's coming in, and hopefully this gives us some inspiration for the conversation here today. So I'm seeing words like innovation as a big one, and a number of others coming in here. Great, let's just let it come in for a minute. Super, you can keep kind of using this word cloud to sort of inspire you as the thinking comes in. I'm just checking it myself here as well online. Great. Collaboration, innovation, carbon price, of course, a key element of our open letter. A lot of inspiration for us here. So I'm hoping Jesper, Wendy, and Rich, you can draw on some of these themes as we dive into the discussion as well. Super. A lot of good ideas coming in. All right, so I think, as we can see, things like innovation, collaboration, carbon price, action, near-term investment, all of these issues and themes, of course, are critical, as we know, to really driving progress on this agenda. What I would love to do, as I said at the beginning, is really turn to some of the leaders that we have on the line with us here today to kind of tell us more about what you're doing as a collective, and then also sort of some of your experience as CEOs in playing a role as well in modeling this transformation within your own businesses. So let me start. We have three amazing panelists with us here today. We have Rich Lesser, the Global Chair of Boston Consulting Group, who has also been a senior advisor to the CEO Climate Leaders with us. Jesper Brodin, Chief Executive of Ingka Group, also co-chair of the CEO Climate Leaders, and of course, Wendy Clark, the Global Chief Executive Officer of Dentsu International. So great to have you all with us here today. And what I'd love to do is start with Rich. Rich, you have been kind of fundamental to the work of the CEO Climate Leaders and the open letter that has been issued last week. Could you maybe just kick us off and tell us a little bit about some of the key messages coming from the open letter and really what tone it's trying to set as we enter these COP discussions here today? Rich, over to you.
Thanks, Antonia. It's great to be here with you and Jesper and Wendy at the start of COP26, and I'm delighted to share some thoughts on that. So let's start with what we're seeing on climate. The IPCC report in August showed us that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C is still technically feasible, but it's really challenging, and it creates an enormous urgency to act quickly. So it's critical that we seize the day here at COP26 to agree to the steps that are required to halve emissions by 2030, to reach net zero emissions by 2050, and to build nature-positive economies. Frankly, the business community will and must do more, but we can't do it alone. And as the more than 90 Alliance CEOs who signed our open letter agree, governments can do three key things to help: put a price on carbon, support first movers, and invest in climate adaptation. And the Alliance of CEO Climate Leaders, where Jesper's one of the co-chairs, is ready to work side by side with governments in a joint public-private effort to accelerate the race to net zero. So if I talk just briefly about each of those three areas, first, in terms of an effective price on carbon and a mechanism to control leakage across borders, it's one of the strongest tools we have to drive emissions reductions and to achieve greater competitiveness of low carbon technologies. 80% of emissions are not covered by regulated carbon pricing today, and those that are have an average price of less than $5 per ton, and this needs to be $50, even up to as high as $150 a ton on average by 2030. Second, in terms of supporting and incenting first movers, companies need policy support to do what's required of them. This includes things like ending investments in fossil fuel assets within this decade, and for some, ideally immediately. Significantly increasing investments in new technologies like green hydrogen, carbon capture, and new processes for hard-to-abate sectors. And shifting portfolios to new solutions like fossil to green fuels, internal combustion engines to battery electric vehicles, and gas boilers to heat pumps. And then third and finally, we should be doing everything we can to push for a 1.5 degrees C future. However, we've got to recognize that the climate is already changing. So governments must invest in adaptation and resilience, from resilient infrastructure to agriculture. And we need to consider those that are most impacted by climate change and are least responsible for causing it, and ensure that developed countries meet and exceed their $100 billion commitment to support developing countries' efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change.
Great, thank you, Rich. And I mean, I think what you've done there is really capture some of those key messages in the context of the letter. You know, of course, finance being critical, kind of setting those targets in terms of really closing the emission gaps that we see still in terms of the NDCs, but also ensuring that the transition is just. Can you maybe also just touch a little bit on kind of some of the leadership from the business community? Of course, as we say in the context of the letter, businesses are leading the way, businesses have set these ambitions and are investing in new solutions. What is maybe one or two examples that you can highlight from this group of leaders of setting the bar high and driving impact today, again, to kind of demonstrate the case for why this is possible and also necessary in the context of calling to governments to do more as well?
Sure. So first of all, you'll hear from Jesper in a minute, and you're going to hear just like great examples that he could talk from. So I will let him do some of that. But I think one of the things that's encouraging is we now have over 4,000 companies that have signed the Race to Zero to put themselves on Paris-aligned carbon reduction pathways. We're seeing across all sectors leaders emerging who are thinking first and foremost about what are the things they can do in the near term in their businesses in order to move to different sources of power, to use renewable power sources, in order to start to work with their supply base, which is really hard to do. I'm not trying to make it sound easy, but there's enormous opportunity in most companies' supply bases to help them on that journey, to move to circularity and take on things like that, and to be constructive advocates for policies along the lines of what we just said, which is what the Alliance of CEO Climate Leaders is looking to do. And so I think some are further along, but I think many companies are earlier in that journey. But we've seen over the last 2 years, I would say, just an enormous step up in the number of companies that realize the urgency of this. They're hearing from their employees, they're hearing from their investors. It makes a big difference. And I think they're getting themselves on good pathways.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's great. And I think we will certainly sort of touch on some of those elements also when we come to Wendy in terms of sort of the response that is coming from employees, but also kind of consumers and citizens. But I think, you know, it is a great transition. I mean, Jesper Brodin, CEO of Ingka Group IKEA, as Rich said, of course, it's one thing to set 2050 net zero targets. This is something that, of course, all of the CEO climate leaders have done. Now, really, the key issue is starting to drive implementation in the near term, right? So we need 2030 targets, and IKEA has set a 2030 target to be climate positive, which would be great if you can talk us through that a little bit more. but also investing today, right? I mean, in order to be able to kind of hit even a 2030 target, the need and expectation is to mobilize action and investment today and start to transition your business and businesses in general. Jesper, could you tell us a little bit more about how kind of within your own company, but also as we think to expand that impact by mobilizing more businesses, how this is playing out?
Absolutely. And let me just maybe start by expressing from my side also, I'm incredibly proud of being part of the 90 plus companies that have signed on to this letter. I think if you look at just a couple of years ago, I think a fewer of us were really aware of the issues and neither had methods or tools in our hands in order to constructively be part of the solution. And what we see today is with the alliance, it's actually a big alliance, not only when it comes to brands and employees, but also if you look at a total responsibility. So I think it's kind of beautiful to see that we are stepping up the game, and we are not here only, as I think Rich mentioned, to be committed, but actually to take actions and to share actions with each other and collaborate around actions. So when it comes to IKEA's climate plan, we set out to target to be climate positive by 2030. So it is a firm commitment to the 1.5 degree Paris Agreement setting out basically. And what we learned along engineering that plan in what we call then Scope 3, which covers them basically from raw material all the way to the homes and the usage of our products and even the afterlife, is obviously that there is no real silver bullet for us to just aim for, but that we need to understand the footprint that we have, transport, production, retailing, life at home, etc., and make sure that we implement smart measures, engineer our way towards the positive side already by 2030. And then you can say, why 2030? Well, we believe it's important, of course, for the world to be at net zero by latest 2050. But in order not to postpone the actions, but to get started, we felt it was important to aim already for 2030 and see what we can do here and now in order to make that possible. So as we look at that, you can say when we started out, it was not so much about relying on others to incentivize that change. Now we are at the point where we would like to discuss, obviously, at COP, how do we speed up and collaboration-wise with governments and with other corporates also take the measures that are necessary now to make sure that the actions don't come in silos but come in a collective power by rejecting parts of the old economy and setting ourselves out faster with policy shifts, taxation, as was mentioned by Rich, but also incentivizing. So we who are among the first investors actually dare to take risks earlier.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think this notion of sort of first movers and indeed taking some risks in order to really transition into the right direction is critical. Maybe just one sort of follow-up question from me. Now, obviously, the CEOs who are part of the CEO Climate Leaders are amongst the first movers who are recognizing the need to move. I think it's fair to say, and we have, a lot of people descending onto Glasgow, I think very positively calling for more action, more progress, not only from governments, but also from the business community and also all stakeholders. What we are not seeing is progress that is moving fast enough. And so as a business leader and part of, let's say, those first movers, how do you respond to this challenge to do more quickly and take kind of the let's say, the acceleration that a group of 91 CEOs has been able to progress in order to rally the wider business community more actively? What can we say to those who are really calling for more, despite the good progress that the CEO Climate Leaders, of course, have driven as a collective?
Well, I think personally, and from my leadership, I also think that until the day we are on track together towards 1.5, obviously we need to do more. So there are, of course, a lot to applaud also, because we can't only be frustrated and critical. We need to look at the movements that have started. As I mentioned, the companies that I have got to know the last few years here have gone through the same type of insights, the leap of faith to commit, the startup of engineering towards solutions, and then recently, I would say more and more reaching out to hook arms across, but also within different industry segments to not only inspire each other to find solutions faster, but also to then collaborate, as Rich was mentioning, with governments in order to make first movement happen quicker. But if I say that, I think it's important, I think, to say nobody here should be waiting for somebody else to take action. So everybody is responsible. And I personally love the notion of the scope 3 responsibility, where you not only look at your direct or indirect energy purchases and consumption, but actually take a responsibility for your business model. That when we did that, obviously it opened up for a lot of big topics, a lot of big responsibilities where we are interlinked with big parts of the economy. But it also opened up for opportunities. If you look at IKEA's movement towards LED lighting, the electric vehicle home deliveries, the investments in renewable energy, the design of products to be recycled, the energy transitions in the production and so forth, all of these actions are part of the Scope 3 plan. And I would say, from my personal perspective, it is incredibly important to make sure that we deliver to the climate positive 2030 within the IKEA network to start with. And then whatever we can do with others is, of course, the bonus.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love the points that you're making now is that as you start to look into the solutions to climate, actually it opens up a whole realm of new innovation possibilities when it comes to business transformation. And I think this is one of the most sort of amazing possibilities when it comes to solving for these types of challenges, is just the innovation that it opens up if we start to open up our minds to the possibility that you say that it can be positive, but also really be positive from an economic and also investment perspective. So I think those are really excellent inputs there. Yes, thank you.
Maybe, Antonia, if I can say that also, I saw the word innovation and you invited us to comment. You know, as far, you know, that is great, and innovation will help us. At the same time, it can be a bit pacifying to say, let's all of us wait for innovation to happen. At this moment, we don't need innovation to resolve the issue. We know that by incentivizing the technology that is already out there, we can actually achieve our targets with the existing technology.
Yes, absolutely. Rich, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one quick point to what Jesper just said. You know, last year we did all this look at supply chains, and the conclusion of looking at that, just to Jesper's point, was that 70 to 80% of carbon can be removed from most of the major supply chains in the world with some cost, not free, but some of it at zero cost and some of it at relatively low cost. It is true the last 20 to 30% in many supply chains is very difficult and does require innovation. But it's no excuse not to now be running as hard as we can to get that first 70% out, 80%, and then work and incent innovation and all the things that will help us over the next 3 decades get that last 30% out. So I couldn't agree more. We cannot use that as an excuse not to act.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, that's a good point for me maybe to turn to Wendy Clark, CEO of Dentsu International. As Rich was saying, in the context of when we look at sort of supply chain decarbonization, the actual end cost to consumers is in certain cases very small. Of course, that cost is borne in different markets and different segments of the economy differently. So I think that's important to sort of recognize, but also from a sort of consumer perspective and for how, let's say, sentiment towards these opportunities is, and also expectations, let's say, from consumers is shifting. What are you hearing and what are you seeing from the work that you're doing to help us, let's say, activate and accelerate engagement of consumers?
Well, thank you, Antonia. And first, I just want to thank Rich and Jesper for their continued leadership of this forum. I mean, to Jesper's point, I know they've been doing this for many years, and I think we now are getting collective scale and the ability to create real impact. And I, too, I'm very proud of our company for being part of this, and we find it existential. I mean, if you don't find it existential, then I don't think you're looking at the data clearly enough. But as you say, look, consumers, and I think we say consumers a lot, we should think generationally too. Millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, who will be 13 next year and start to come into the economy with their own spending, are all very clear on their expectations around what they expect from brands, from companies, where they will make those buying decisions. And we see a great amount of availability from the mindset perspective of those generations, particularly. They are driving and demanding the brands and companies engage with them and have products for them that meet their expectations. In fact, in our own research, we find that consumers by 2030, their mindset and their opinions about brands will become less tolerant and less patient of those brands and companies that are not living into a social good and a sustainable platform and are not decarbonizing their companies and their footprint. So you see this very, very clearly articulated by consumers. Now, the quick response may be, well, hang on a minute, so where's demand? Because we would say only 2% of electric vehicles in the US, only 2% of vehicles are electric vehicle sales. So, where's the demand? And I think that's where critically our industry comes into play, because we have to shape consumer behavior now, and we have to shape that demand. The UK Climate Committee for Change said that 59% of our net zero transition will come from consumer behavior change. So there's the gap. We have an intention, and then we have a reality that we've got to close here. But that's, again, what we do. We create sensational brands. We create irresistibility for brands. And I think that this, one of my colleagues called this perhaps the greatest brief that the marketing industry may ever receive, to save the planet. I mean, is there any greater brief that we could receive? And so it will take creativity. It will take innovation. It will take ingenuity. It is going to take focus. It's going to take, yes, new ideas. I think Jesper makes a great point. We have many ideas that need more funding and more scaling and more focus. But that is all within our reach, and it is all within our ability to do it. A minute ago, you asked for examples. We're privileged to work with IKEA, and there are many, and I'll let Jesper speak about his. So I'll reference another client of ours, Kroger in the US, the second largest grocery chain in the US, wanted to address food waste. And we created an AI Twitter bot for consumers to use, that they input all their leftover food in their fridge, and it creates recipes. I mean, food waste is one of the greatest challenges. And by a simple innovation, a simple available tool for consumers, they are now part of the solution around food waste. Really important commitment for Kroger. So just one example, there are many out there, but it is entirely possible, and consumers want it.
It's a great point, and maybe, I mean, just two things that are jumping to my mind is, of course, struck, and I think it will strike anyone coming into Glasgow, how visible climate change is at the moment. Every single billboard, everything, every corner you turn, you see, the urgency of tackling climate change, and it's front and center. But of course, that's front and center in the context of the COP. And I suppose that's part of our collective challenge, is how do we ensure that this issue and this agenda is front and center all the time, so that kind of people really start to understand and learn about the issue, but also what actions they can take as consumers. And Wendy, if I can just maybe ping back to you, there's a question that's come up in the chat here, is I think you talk about sort of consumer awareness sentiment. And indeed, it is noted that this is obviously, of course, increasing and active. It says here there is a strong driving force for climate action in Europe, but not as much in regions like Asia. And I think the question that's coming in is how do we overcome that? I think that, of course, having lived in Asia, it's one thing to say, yes, let's transition to climate-friendly products today. What I at least saw when I was living in Asia is, in certain cases, actually, that access to certain products and services were part and parcel of attaining economic progress and wealth, and that was just part of the cultural element. And I think the question is, how do you overcome that? How do we ensure that actually moving towards climate-friendly products and solutions is part of attaining wealth and growth in those economies as well. So just would love to hear your thoughts on that question that's come into us from the chat.
Well, it's a shame. Often Alan Jope is among us, and he speaks eloquently about his company's focus and deployment of products in emerging and developing markets, and how both the supply chain costs are mitigated. They're absolutely normative to his regular supply chain costs. The product is actually better, so you have a better product, and they are able to distribute into these emerging markets and developing markets. So I don't think it's entirely the case that these products always have to be more expensive, or that they are, and that they should be unattainable. You start with any marketer starts with the consumer, right? So you start with where the consumer demand is, and in those markets, you typically are doing smaller sizes. You're thinking about the distribution channels that are available. I mean, you have to adjust your portfolio and your product offering to what the market can sustain. But again, if supply chain costs are mitigated and the product is equal cost to provide, and indeed, in at least Unilever's case, it's a better product, then you have a win-win scenario and outcome there. So I think it is absolutely possible. We've got many cases. I'm thinking of some off the top of my head. We've got a case in Thailand where we developed an app where consumers could understand what fish were available in the marketplace, and if they were purchasing, a fish that should be protected and not be eaten, or not be so highly delivered and available in the marketplace. So that's one case. We've done some work with a vegan egg company in another market in Asia. Obviously, for a Japanese company, we have huge examples in Japan. That's a bit more of a developed market, and I think at the core of the question is emerging and developing economies. But it is absolutely possible to bring solutions to the marketplace, again, with the right innovation, collaboration, and focus.
Absolutely. No, excellent points. And maybe I'd love to kind of just get your thoughts on this point, Jesper, as well. Of course, kind of, very global in reach, and also driving your climate ambitions equally globally. And maybe just with your thoughts on that question, just throwing in another question that's come in from the audience here is maybe just an example of how you've gone about effectively reducing your Scope 3 emissions. I think you did talk about, and not you, but just also companies in general, you talked about the need and importance to be accountable for your Scope 3 emissions. Maybe if you want to just illustrate that, but would love to kind of pick up on the consumer discussion first as well.
Absolutely. No, but I'm absolutely with you, Wendy, on the consumer side. Interesting enough, we do annually, we do a survey with 30,000 people, customers around the world. And we have seen two things very clear. It's an absolute spike in interest and worrying about climate. So in our clientele, which is quite representative, I think, for any market, it's way above 70% of people being worried. It doesn't vary a lot from Sweden to US to China. So we have stopped reflecting on consumers having a different view on this and more assuming on how we support and help. And to the point that Wendy did also, there's a lot of examples out there, including in IKEA's supply chain, where climate smart is resource smart and therefore cost smart. So, there's lots of examples about where we all are winners, basically. So it's not all about barriers and investments and taxation and subsidies, etc., but actually doing the right thing. The opposite, I know that Unilever and other companies like us are convinced that the opposite would be very dangerous for a company that work with people within wallets. Because ultimately that type of behavior, when we are more people sharing the same resources, is not going to lead to a success for your company. So the innovation is really implementing smart measures around that. But then you can say at the same time, there is no, as far as we know, there is not one or two things you need to do. You need to work on your raw material sourcing. You need to work on the energy consumption in your production setups. You need to work on being part of and driving the shift of heavy transport. When we look at the retailing sector, IKEA has invested since, I think, 8 years now ago, we started to invest in renewable energy. We have now invested, so we are actually invested more than, index 130. So more renewable energy invested in our group than we consume. We are not there, so we are 1-to-1 in all parts, but we are on the way and the track to do that, as much as we are improving the state of our real estate, so they are more climate smart and climate friendly. And then you can say all the way to offering veggie balls instead of meatballs, making flat packs flatter, and so forth. But I would say the three big shifts that we are part of, where we also reach out through the platform of WFCO Climate Alliance, is the energy transformation. And it's happening, and it's not going to be reversed or anything, but we all could benefit if we can move faster. The electrification or the renewable into mobility and everything transport is one where we are, I would say we are investing, we are moving in particular last mile deliveries, but it's also an infrastructure change that needs to happen together in society. And finally, which we think is incredibly interesting, is and I think, Wendy, you were on to that too, the whole aspect of consumption is to be shifted from a linear model to a circular model, or if I say a circular plus renewable model. We know it's within our reach to make it happen, but it requires also infrastructure that takes back material and don't subsidize or incentivize dumping or incineration of material that we can use for making new products. So these shifts needs to happen in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it is clear that kind of, let's say, our economic system has been optimized for the wrong thing. It's been optimized for throughput, and we need to sort of re-optimize it for kind of circularity, as you said, in order also to help tackle the climate challenge. Another, let's say, related question that I see has come in here, and you started to touch on this, Jesper, as well, is, of course, it's about CO2 emissions, but it's also related to, let's say, the broader connected set of issues on the nature side, land use, food transformation, which of course is a big theme and an area of work that's being pushed across the COP this week as well. We know that nature can result in about a third of the solution to the climate challenge as well, if we invest in the right places. And so one of the questions is, how do we make sure that we don't neglect this side of the picture, as well as looking at things like toxins and pesticides and other related issues. So I don't know if somebody wants to sort of pick up on that connection, let's say the broader perspective on how we tackle climate change as a system issue, rather than just looking really at CO2 mitigation, which we can be at risk of doing at times in these discussions. Rich, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, just a couple points. One is, I'm really glad that the person who raised the question did so. You know, we talk about science-based targets as it relates to carbon, and we need them because it's urgent, all the things we discussed earlier. But we're also going to need targets as it relates to nature, whether it's preservation of species, whether it's dealing with land degradation, whether it's creating more renewable agriculture practices, whether it's forest preservation and reforestation, mangroves. There's obviously our water systems around the world are under enormous strain right now. And so on many different levels, we have a responsibility to nature too, some of which is directly synergistic with taking carbon out of the air. If we can find more renewable agriculture practices, you can also increase the carbon content in soil. If we take on forests in a proactive and productive way, we obviously find ways to sink carbon. So there's elements of that are linked. But our language, when we're talking about it, is normally climate and sustainability. And yes, climate, I think because of the urgency, because of the precipitous nature of the path we're on, has to come first. But the sustainability elements of it are really clear. And there's a lot that can be done, starting with some of the circularity points that Jesper raised, but also including how we work with nature and act as honestly just a better partner to nature in the years ahead.
Wendy?
Antonia, I was just going to bring up, it's a linked point, but I think it's important to reference this alliance, the 90 companies in this alliance have 8 million employees. And so if you're wondering where to get started, I think start with your own associates. And that's what we really got traction internally. And the cultural message that this sent to our employees, that we were putting our actions behind this narrative and the pride that they feel. And then helping them, again, back to 59% of the net zero transition happening from individual consumer behaviors means we're sending 8 million people into the world better equipped, right? So we've been looking at things, obviously, do we do renewable energy certificates to help them bring renewable energy into their homes? For our company cars, do we mandate that company cars are now electric vehicles by a certain date? We've done our own commitment on flight emission reduction, and will people take those into their own lives and their own travel decisions? So again, I think you have that great place, and I love that this alliance can actually move as a fairly scaled entity here to make some of these commitments both at scale for our companies, but then have our employees pull those through into their personal lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Wendy, you made the point that, at every layer, ultimately, we're talking about individuals and citizens. It's not necessarily about being consumers. It's not necessarily about being employees, in the sense that every individual is touched by these issues in different ways every day. And every individual can be empowered, as you say, through different tools and activities, through their jobs, the roles that they play, the roles that you play. And 8 million, of course, is a lot to be able to kind of activate through this group. And I think that that's really an important place to start. They always say kind of you have to walk the talk, so to speak, before kind of going out and influencing more broadly as well. I think I just want to kind of recognizing we're coming to a close, but also for me, really coming to the beginning, right? Just sort of setting ourselves again into the point that we're here at the beginning of COP26. I can say that there are thousands of people kind of in Glasgow. I've been out on the streets. They're rallying, kind of coming into the Congress Center with very high expectations and hopes that world leaders will come out of these 2 weeks with firm additional commitments, but also, I think, with a collective sense of inspiration that we can tackle this challenge. And I think the two kind of questions, I'll start with one that I would love to kind of ask each of you. So first, as a group of CO climate leaders, what is your sort of key message to other business leaders who are maybe listening to this discussion and haven't maybe taken that leap as far as this group has? What would you say to them to encourage them to really ramp up their climate ambition? So let me just quickly start with that question, and then I'll have another to close off as well. But Jesper, maybe I can start with you. What would be your message to kind of other global business leaders out there to kind of ramp up their climate ambition?
I would say two things, depending on, of course, your leadership style, where a lot of leaders out there are a little bit reluctant sometimes to commit without having the plan in place. I think this is an area where the world expects us to commit and take a leap of faith. In order to show that there is no other alternative, basically. So take that leap of faith. And secondly, I would say, I think the time is maybe already here or is coming very soon when it's very dangerous to be left on the platform where the train has left to ripe the benefits from a brand perspective, as Wendy speaks to, from a cost perspective, from relations in society, from appreciation from co-workers and customers. So I think it's a huge risk to be too slow on this. So join the movement.
Rich?
2 points. The first, just to build directly on Jesper, the responsibility of every business leader is sustainable value creation. That's what we're charged with, not just optimizing for a very near term, but creating engines for sustainable value creation. And that requires sustainable competitive advantage. And in a world where we need to invest $3 to $5 trillion a year for 30 years as a global economy, to not look at your business and say, how do I get tailwinds behind me, take advantage of that investment, get ahead of it, and build a new source of competitive advantage, to me is you really have to look in the mirror and say, am I doing my job around sustainable value creation? add the second point, which is true in all aspects of life, but given the urgency of climate, the true test of character is not just what you say in big settings, but what you do when no one is looking. And I think right now the world is counting on us, of course, to participate in things like this, of course, to be bold in what we commit to. It's also looking for what we do when no one's watching in terms of how we guide our team, how we set priorities in our strategic plans, the advocacy we take in the public arena when we have opportunities, privileged opportunities often to engage with leaders in the public sector. And I think the world is watching and counting on us to live up to the character that the moment requires and the urgency of this issue requires.
Absolutely. Wendy?
Well, I'd say read the IPCC report and even the headlines from that, right? It is code red for humanity. How can you read that and go, well, I'll sit on the sidelines and wait it out? I mean, like I said, it's existential, and your consumers want it, your employees want it. You're going to find yourself, to Jesper's point, left on the platform because that society is now moving. The evidence and research is very, very clear that it's going to be punitive very quickly for brands and companies who are not seen as participating and contributing to the solutions here. So in a word, I'd say you just got to get started, and you just have to do it. The time is now.
Great. I mean, I think those are great reflections, and maybe sort of my last and sort of closing question for each of you. I can say personally that I am entering this COP with a lot of hope, right? And I think that for some of us who have been working on the climate agenda for many years, it can be a frustrating and challenging journey. But I've never myself seen such a mobilization of non-state actors also around supporting governments and encouraging them to do more. And I think that's kind of how I'm going into this COP. And I would just love to hear from each of you again, sort of what is your hope and expectation going into this COP? What do you hope to see? What is your hope? And what do you want to close kind of in this discussion to share with the audience for this conversation as well? So maybe I'll go in reverse order here, but Wendy, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, I think, Antonia, just settle on the opening slide, because I think you've got a quorum of people here who came together and had those words on the slides. And what I think we all hope for is collaboration. I think we want to see action. There's an urgency that we have to see now. We cannot kick the can, American phrase, sorry, we can't kick the can down the road any longer, right? We must take action now. It's going to require public, private, societal collaboration to make these commitments and to make progress. But business, we are here ready to collaborate. We're here ready for this moment, and we're all participating. We want to see that movement. And indeed, I think we're hopeful, but I think we're also restless. It is time.
Absolutely. Rich, your thoughts?
So where I'm genuinely optimistic is the links that exist between the public and private sector that are deeper and stronger and more grounded in how we move things forward together than we've had before. And that has not been the history of COP. COP was a governmental interaction forum. So this outreach, the high-level champions have sponsored, the what's been done to me is genuinely cause for optimism and high expectation. Where I'm a bit more sober is the government-to-government agreements themselves. And therefore, my hope is that even if it doesn't come quite as far as we want in those agreements, that we realize we're in a marathon, not a sprint. And if we don't get as far as we want this year, then we go after it in Egypt, and we go after it. Like, we cannot stop pushing incredibly hard and know that there'll be great days and harder days. I hope COP will be filled with a lot of great days, but regardless, we have to keep pushing. Absolutely.
Jesper, over to you.
Thank you. No, we are very incredibly well aligned, I would say. Three things comes to mind. It's about action. It's not about commitment anymore, and there might be parts of society not committed, but we simply don't have time, and there is a bulk of companies and countries who are committed. So it's all about action. Stay focused on what we have promised to deliver on it and talk about that, the solutions. Secondly, I think to really set the example, and here I come back to our own responsibility, my own, but also the Climate Alliance in WEF, and that is to prove that it is good business to be a good business. And the proof points will inspire. And I think that's incredibly important. And then I think the third part, I think it's about bringing hope and optimism to the table. As I hear from Wendy and Rich also, let's see where we end up at the end of COP, but I'm sure we're not going to get all the way, as Rich is referring to, but we need to keep the fire alight, and when it comes to hope and optimism, and we need to engage more than just politicians and corporate leaders on both the solutions, the plans, and the things that we are taking action on. So we are not abandoning the topic at the COP, but actually getting deeper involved and engaged in resolving it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for those inspiring, I think, words of optimism and hope. Of course, as we, let's say, start the journey at COP, as you say, this is an important moment in time. It's a mobilization, but it certainly doesn't end here. So I think with that, Jesper, Wendy, Rich, a very big thank you to joining this conversation. A big thank you for the leadership in driving the CO climate leaders as that sort of collaborative effort to raise ambition, but also to collaborate, as you say, with the public sector to help us collectively do more and go faster. So I hope that this conversation has inspired action in others, has provided hope and optimism to those who are joining us live as well. And what I would do is encourage you all, of course, to follow the live stream sessions throughout the next 2 weeks. You can see them on the forum platform, covering everything from looking at carbon pricing to industry transition to nature-based solutions, because as we know, it will take quite a lot of measures and activities to help drive this transformation, but we have solutions, and our expectation is that we have to, and we can do this if we do it together. So thank you again, and we'll stay tuned and be in touch and see hopefully some of you here in Glasgow. Thank you very much for joining.